Hello, and welcome to Sounding Board, a community access television production of Seroptimus International of Novato. My name is Madeline Peters, and I have as my guest here Dr. Denise Zinn from Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, Port Elizabeth, South Africa. And her topic today is on another take on the 80-20 principle, the challenge for teacher education in South Africa, of serving the majority rather than the minority. But first, before I let Dr. Zinn talk a little bit about herself, a message about Seroptimus International. We are a professional organization that advances the status of women and girls, locally and internationally. Again, Dr. Denise Zinn is here from South Africa, and I'm most pleased, Dr. Denise Zinn, to have you here. I'd like you to say a few words about your background and your work, and then we'll launch into the discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you, and hello. I'm Denise Zinn, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here. About my background, it's been a very patchy background with lots of pieces from all over. But I guess the thing that's most significant for me about that background in relation to this topic is that I went to a high school at a time when segregation was rife. It was the way of our world in South Africa, and I went to a school that was really very political. We had at the time, this was in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, 10 teachers at our school who had either been imprisoned, placed on Robben Island, sent into exile into the interior. But what that did was imbued the high school that I was at with a political consciousness that I think has influenced and determined all the choices I've made since then. So,
well, you started off with an impressive experience, and you're currently Executive Dean, Faculty of Education at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about your story, your focus on education in South Africa and that 80-20. And if you could explain a little bit about what is going on in South Africa right now in terms of education.
Well, the 80-20 principle, as you may know, is a principle, it's called the Pareto principle, and people sort of use those two percentages to mean all kinds of things. But essentially, I think I chose that because for us in education, we find that the colonial history and the legacy of a colonial history and an apartheid history has left us with a situation in schools and in education in general where the 80%, or in a province like the one I come from in the Eastern Cape, it's really the 90%, remain abandoned. They remain a majority that is actually not being served by the change that has happened in the country. And part of that is because the legacy of the past has been so huge. It has left an imbalance, an inequity that makes it very, very difficult to find ways to actually redress that past. And this is why I've chosen this as the focus and the direction for us in teacher education.
Could you just summarize that legacy, and what actually was in place for many, many years in South Africa in terms of the people who are abandoned, the people who make the decisions? And could you just describe that a bit?
So I guess what's most pertinent about this is the fact that the 100% were artificially divided to set up a divide and rule situation where the majority, who make up between 70 and 80% of the population, who were people of dark hue, the black and people of color in South Africa, were divided up into these artificial minorities, so that those who were of European descent then were the artificial majority, so that all white people were just called white people, but black people were divided into colored, Indian, Zulu, Xhosa, Isisotho, so this whole range of artificial divisions that made up segregation. And the legacy that has left is that 75% of the wealth of the country was really spent on the 25% or the 20% that were the minority. And once we sort of had the democratic change in 1994, the democratic elections, the 100% now had to be spent on the 100%. But the legacy of apartheid left the 25% or the 20% with all the resources. So the best schools, schools that in the States here would seem like private schools, huge facilities, swimming pools, halls. They really look like private. They really do look like private schools, but they're public schools. The majority, the 75 to 80%, have a combination of mud schools, poor infrastructure, no facilities, very poor resources. And it's been very difficult for the government to now create a redress policy that addresses the 75% to the 80%. I think in teacher education, besides the physical infrastructure, there's also a sense of what is the ideal classroom, who is the ideal student, what makes up the ideal teacher, and what has influenced thinking around that has been the 25% who have had everything, the 20% who have had the most of what the country has to offer. And that then becomes a standard against which everything is judged, and also the standard to which everyone has aspired, and saying, well, we're going to have to be like those schools if we're going to be successful. And we're finding that that's just impossible, first of all. But it may also be an artificial model to be aspiring towards.
So you're saying that since 1994, when 100% of the resources were to be spent on the 100%, that what's happened is a mindset that still was reflective of the 20%, that's still maintaining, if I'm correct in paraphrasing you, maintaining control, influence, resources, access to quality education, even to this day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what has happened is that those who are now in power have had access to those schools. So those schools are integrated, but you have to have the resources, the financial resources, to be able to access those schools. So there are huge school fees. They operate like private schools. You have to be able to get there in terms of living close to the school or having the transport to get there. You have to be able to pay for additional teachers to keep the class sizes small. So there's a class division now that creates access for some and exclusion of the majority still in those kinds of schools.
If you could step back from the school itself, what are the circumstances surrounding the different schools, like the location? You mentioned access or distance or resources. What does the area around these schools look like? If you can comment on that.
Yes, so looking again at the 80-20 principle and the legacy, what has happened is that geopolitically, what has not been able to change is the segregated townships. People who live in those segregated townships, who are poor, who are working class, have not been able to move out of those into middle class areas. A very, very small number of them have been able to do that. So it has created a situation where the townships remain all black, they remain poor, the schools remain the schools as they were under apartheid. So even though in terms of political access and power, everybody can now vote. They can vote for the government that we have in power, but what has not changed is where people live. What has not changed is the way those schools look. What has not changed is the access to resources, because it's not as though by distributing the 100%, those who are in the 70% majority now have more. They do have slightly more than they used to have before, but not sufficient to have changed the conditions in those schools and in those communities around those schools to the kind of wealth and comfort that exists in the 20% in the middle class neighborhoods and in the upper class neighborhoods. So essentially the situation is very much the same, with the majority of schools being under-resourced, poorly resourced, and not having access to what they need for a good education.
So you talked about the class structure, and there's the geographic structure that you said, I believe, has not really shifted or changed in any measurable way to allow, or to permit the 80% to access the better schools and resources. We also talked about the concept of disadvantage. There's a mindset. Okay, that's sort of the physical structure, I believe, and please feel free to add to that. But in our, we also in previous discussion talked about the concept of disadvantage, and I think that's very interesting to spend some time talking about.
So while these conditions exist now, and there's sort of huge outrage at the fact that this continues to happen, and there are all these aspirations for what we called Model C schools, which are the integrated schools that were previously only accessed by white citizens of the country. There was also something happening in the schools of the people of color, and I started by introducing myself via the school I went to. So there were also people and movements and a political consciousness around the conditions under which we lived and had to go to school that was, on the one hand, fiercely resistant of the government's plan to keep us back from the kind of sort of experience and future which we knew had to change given the inequities in the system. So what that did was built in us and built a whole, movement, the anti-apartheid movement, but a movement of resistance as well as resilience, and a sense that we were not going to let the material conditions hold us back. And what that meant was that we had to organize in ways that brought community together to support a development and an aspirational goal of success that now stands us actually in very good stead. So someone like me, who came from schools like that, now in a position as a dean of a faculty of education, I bring with me a mindset that is very different to a leader in an institution that previously would have been a white leader in a university setup, who would think about teacher education in a particular kind of way, which is we need to have these kinds of standards, they need to include certain minimum criteria. I bring a very different kind of mindset, and not just me, but people like me, that says that under the most adverse of conditions, we succeeded. And what did it take for us to succeed? It took a particular kind of resilience, a particular kind of determination, a particular kind of aspirational goal. And I sit as the dean of a very large institution, major university. I attended Harvard University as a scholar. I won scholarships, and this was after having come from a school that wouldn't come anywhere close to competing physically, infrastructurally, with some of the better schools in the country. But what we had in that school was a teaching corps that was so determined to make a difference in the lives of their students, that were prepared for the kind of conditions that kept us back from achieving our goals, and put everything that they possibly could in place to help us reach those.
So this was your high school.
This was my high school.
This was your high school, and you developed the resistance and resilience that carried you through, and along with the support of the teachers at that school to make a change, to move to make a change. And okay, let's shift a little bit and talk about your role right now. You mentioned your high school and the influence of your high school, and then going on to university, and then you mentioned, I know you studied at Harvard for, I think, 6 years, was it, for your master's and doctorate, so, and then again back to South Africa and your influence there. So you can feel free to touch on any one of those aspects, but I want to see what's going on, how your leadership is helping to foster that change in South African education.
So, facing a situation at the moment where there is a real shortage of teachers, and where teacher education has now become what we call a scarce skill in the country, the idea is, what kind of teachers, what kind of teacher education do we need? And one of the things that I guess is I've been open to is to looking at how do we place our student teachers in schools that would not be seen as the ideal kinds of schools in which teachers, student teachers, can come into their own and learn and be mentored. In the institution that I'm in, just by way of example at the moment, which was an Afrikaner institution, actually. The university now has the name of Nelson Mandela, but previously it was called the University of Port Elizabeth. It was an Afrikaner university, and dominated by the same kind of sort of apartheid ideologies as many of the other Afrikaner universities. But it has seen a complete shift with new management and leadership, and space to actually develop a very different kind of thinking around what is needed in the teaching profession. So we've partnered up with schools that would normally be considered dysfunctional schools. They would normally be considered schools, they would be spoken about in deficit terms. So the students who come from these schools are deficient, in the skills that they need. We therefore cannot place our students there, or the schools are deficient in terms of infrastructure, they're dysfunctional, and therefore we cannot place our students there, because how are our students going to learn to be good teachers? What we have found is by partnering with these schools, the ones who are determined and exhibit the same kind of resilience and determination as my old high school, and there are several of those, what we have found is that these schools have taught us about what is needed if we are going to supply teachers for the new generations of schools. They've taught us that we need a particular kind of teacher education that is going to prepare teachers for the realities of the 80%. So this is sort of coming back to the 80-20%. Right. Whereas previously, what a university like mine was doing was preparing teachers for the 10% and the 20%. And the teachers who then, the student teachers or the newly qualified teachers, would actually shy away from going to, ever choosing to teach in schools that didn't have all the resources. So they would always be gravitating towards schools that had a minimum set of resources, where they would be paid a certain salary, where it wouldn't be difficult for them to access those schools. And what we are needing to do now in teacher education is saying that if the majority of the schools are in these kinds of conditions, what do we need to be putting in place in teacher education to prepare new generations of teachers for those conditions?
What are those elements that you need to put into place for these teachers?
They need to be supermen. They need to be superheroes. And there's an interesting story I can tell you about this. We invited principals and teachers from those schools that would normally not have been considered as suitable placements for our student teachers to come and talk to us during a curriculum colloquium on what's happening in schools now that we need to be aware of. And these principals came and spoke to us about the conditions in their schools. They spoke about gang-ridden neighborhoods. They spoke about frequent robberies at the school, the trashing and the vandalization of schools. They spoke about students being raped. They spoke about HIV and AIDS orphans. They spoke about lack of sanitation in the schools. And as they were talking, some of the staff on my faculty at the university raised hands, and one of them said, but you know, you can't expect us to be supermen. For us to be able to take on those kinds of conditions, we'd have to be supermen. Another one said, but you know, the young people who come into teaching, I mean, all they want is to have a job, you know, and get married someday and have a house and kids and a little car. And, you know, what you're asking them to take on is not what they would imagine they have to do. Another one got up and said, well, surely there have to be certain minimum standards in place in the schools before we can send our students there. And the principals got up and said, what we expect of you as the Faculty of Education is to produce supermen. We expect you to be able to take on those conditions because those are the conditions that exist for the 80% of the schools in this country. And it was a huge, sort of this aha moment that's what we've got to be doing. We've got to be producing students and teachers and a kind of teacher education that prepares people for the majority of what they're going to find out there, as opposed to what we've been doing all the time, which is using Western models and models in first world countries of the kind of teacher education and the kind of classroom that we would expect. So that's been the shift. It's been quite a fundamental shift, and it's the interesting piece is that students who were part of that audience said, that's what we want. We want to make a difference. So bring it on. Tell us what it is we have to do.
So you actually, I mean, it seems as though you had the education of your faculty, the bringing in of the community, as well as like a shift or change in thinking in terms of the role of the university and faculty and what is needed in the schools. Now, this is, we're coming to the end of our time, so what I'd like you to do is just take a moment to emphasize one or two key points that are important to you to emphasize about this shift in thinking and this change in the expectations for the kind of teachers that are needed for the 80%, for the 100%.
So I guess the main thing, and I connect this up again with this wonderful high school, is we need teachers who have a sense of mission. And when you are a missionary, the conditions into which you go become a challenge as opposed to an obstacle. So we need teachers who do have that sense of mission, and we need to think about how we're going to build that. And the way we build that is not by keeping them away from those schools. What we are finding is that by sending both our teacher educators and our students into these schools, they are actually inspired by a sense of being able to make a difference in the world.
So that's what you're doing, is helping build that awareness and that understanding they are going to make a difference. Dr. Zinn, we're out of time. I want to thank you very much for being here and for sharing your information about the shift in thinking and practice in building students and teachers to really serve the population of South Africa, the students in need. Thank you very much. Again, this is a public access television program, Seroptimus International of Novato. Our Seroptimus members serve as the crew to put together programs like this on a regular basis. My name is Madeline Peters, and I'd want to take this opportunity to thank our guest, Dr. Denise Zinn from Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, for being here to discuss education in South Africa, the shift in the 80-20%. Thank you very much.